good afternoon to our participants from the UK and Europe, and of course, good morning to those that have come into the session from the USA. Super excited to be here to speak to you today about mobility and accessibility in business travel. It's a poignant moment for us. This is actually the 16th edition of Travel Talks in a month where Grey Doors made their 16th acquisition down in Australia. So lots and lots going on here at the business. In today's session, please feel free to ask any questions that you may have using the Q&A function, and we'll try to get around to as many of those as possible. By way of introductions, my name's Julian Munsey. I'm VP of Global Sales here at Grey Doors, and today I'm joined by Britt Clayton, who's our Diversity and Inclusion Manager. So to kick off, Britt, can you perhaps introduce yourself, tell the audience a little bit about your journey to the position you have here now, and what excites you about your role?
Yeah, so I have quite a strange journey, which isn't sort of an unusual thing in diversity and inclusion, because it's not sort of a traditional kind of you go to university kind of job timeline, if you will. So I actually started out in investigations, investigating the police, which is quite an unusual and strange job.
Very different, yeah.
Yeah, very different from what I'm doing now. But within that, I started sort of getting involved in the staff network, and sort of eventually became a chair of the LGBT one, and did a lot of work with the disability network as well. And I kind of got an internal secondment, which kind of naturally allowed me to kind of transition over into kind of full-time EDI work. So I've worked in hospitals, I've worked for sort of learning societies, and I've done a lot of consultancy work, so going into business, finding out what problems are, and either providing training around that problem or some policy or other kind of strategic oversight there to kind of just figure out what it is they need and what their service users need a lot of the time.
Okay, cool. So you've worked across a range of different industries, and travel is something that's new to you. But I think one of the things I want to ask you before we sort of kick off and talk specifically about travel is that I should imagine that the participants may be at different stages of their journey when it comes to diversity and inclusion, accessibility in their travel program. Some may be on the session today because they're just starting to think about it. Some may have more maturity in their program. But one of the things that's sort of been mentioned to me in the past is that when it comes to diversity and inclusion, sometimes people are a little bit afraid to talk about it as a subject because they're afraid of using the wrong terminology or saying something incorrectly. What's your advice to the audience on that? What do you think they should do? How should they approach it?
I think that the best thing you can do is be prepared to be wrong. Be comfortable with being wrong, because the nature of EDI and D&I sort of work is that the language changes quite often because we realise maybe that word doesn't fit anymore, or that term we've used previously, maybe it's just not the most positive or empowering term. So I think be open and be ready to be wrong, but also just apologise if you get something wrong. It doesn't need to be an over-the-top apology. You don't need to beg for their forgiveness. You just sort of need to say a quick, "Oh, thank you for letting me know," and move on. I think the more people labour it, and I think the problem is a lot of the time people build it up into their head so they're going to be really offensive if they get the wrong term. Whereas if you're somebody who uses labels that other people might not understand, chances are you're probably used to it. And so you're prepared to have that happen, and you're aware that it's going to happen. So when it does, it's not really a surprise.
So it's better to have a conversation than be scared to have one at all. Good. Okay, cool. I think that the first question I've got is, obviously we've talked about how you're sort of relatively new to the world of travel. What's your sort of assessment of how well we're doing as an industry? So if you look at transportation, trains, public transport, airports, airlines, hotels, what's your sort of first thoughts around the provision that's been made?
I think there's a lot of really, really good intentions. I think that more and more people are sort of realising that they need to do more, which I think is great. But I think there's a little bit of a disconnect there between intention and action. And a lot of companies will say they do stuff. And I saw a report recently from the BBC correspondent Frank Gardner, who's a wheelchair user. And he was on a flight recently, and they didn't have a wheelchair for the aeroplane, which they should have. So to go to the toilet, he had to drag himself up the aisle towards the toilet, which nobody should have to do in 2024. But the fact that somebody is high profile is Frank Gardner had to do that, it kind of tells you the story in of itself that we're not where we should be remotely. And I think a lot of the mindset around disability needs to change, because I think people think of it as this kind of one size fits all thing.
Yeah.
When really, you know, if you put 50 people with disabilities in a room, you're going to have 50 different sets of needs there.
Yeah.
Because we're all unique individuals, and there's all other things that factor into it. So you've kind of got to use from it what we call in the EDI world a kind of intersectional approach,
right,
where you look at people as individuals with all that they are, rather than just as a person with a disability, for example.
Yeah, and that's something that's really interesting, actually, because I have personal experience with this. One of my daughters is disabled. She has quite a lot of complexity around her disability. And when we travel, it's interesting. I read a statistic recently, and I think it's probably come from the 2021 census, that in the UK, there's now 16 million people that are sort of disabled, okay?
Yeah.
And when you delve into the figures, that includes 23% of working age adults. That's a lot of, you know, people that identify as being disabled. And from personal experience, when you say go to the airport, for example, they make provision for everybody that needs additional need. And what it's actually leading to is the fact that that resource becomes stretched. Okay. So I suppose the difficult thing, and I'd just like some thoughts for you on this, is how can suppliers do better to provide appropriate provisions when there's an array of different needs, when of course actually, you know, you have to be very sensitive to the individual and what they want to share with you about their need, for example.
Yeah, so I think one thing that I think is really important is giving people as much information as you can. So for example, if you are running an airport, you're working with those sorts of environments, is spelling out things like how many steps it takes to get from what is considered, you know, the front entrance to check-in, for example, and then from check-in, how many steps would it take to security? So people could decide for themselves. Say, for example, sometimes somebody might use a wheelchair, or other times they actually might be fine with crutches. You're giving them that information so they're empowered to make that decision themselves.
Yeah.
So we're not actually making decisions. We're giving people information and giving them options so they decide what's best. I think it's East Midlands Airport now has an app that you can use, so you can pre-arrange your accessibility requirements in advance so that you don't turn up and they're not surprised and they go, oh my God, scrambling around thinking, how are we going to help you? Actually, they know in advance. So I think there's also an element there where technology can come in and be really useful. But I think it can be over-relied on as well. It's going to solve all problems when we know it's just not going to happen.
No, and I think we'll come on to that in a bit, because you know, invariably these conversations result in some talk around technology. But I think one of the interesting things is that actually the fact that the airlines are perhaps taking more, we'll use the word responsibility, but they're taking more responsibility for it, when traditionally information has had to go to the airline to be then to be shared onwards, is probably quite a good approach. We've actually had a question in from the audience already, and we'll come back to accessibility and disability in the conversation. But this is actually a really good question, because they've said that, of course, accessibility doesn't only relate to disability. If you think about gender, sexuality, religion, political belief, they can also add complexity to travel. What's your thoughts around that, and what resources are out there to help, you know, travel managers and travel buyers sort of navigate that complexity, and ultimately the traveller themselves?
I think it's really, really difficult. I mean, I've experienced it myself. I mean, I've been shouted at in a number of airport toilets that I'm in the wrong toilet, and I've sort of just had to vaguely gesture at myself. Because I don't speak, you know, Portuguese or whatever language I'm in the airport of, and kind of be like, no, I'm okay here. But that still doesn't stop. You know, I've been in rest stations in Wyoming and Utah, which were two of the most uncomfortable experiences of my life, where I was genuinely not sure what I should do here and am I going to be safe. And it was, you know, there's a difficult thing to manage that. If you're sending your staff out, you have to make sure that you've kind of done risk assessments beforehand. Is this person going to be safe? Are they comfortable with going, or are they just afraid of saying no? Actually giving people outs if you're not sure if that's a safe space. But a lot of people will actually say, no, I want to go and do this. And that should always be their choice, I think, ultimately. But I think, you know, there's very good resources. There's an organization called Maiden Voyage, who have a lot of information packs and safety packs around being an LGBT traveler abroad, or being a woman and traveling abroad. And then there's all those kinds of things where a lot of it's just about having conversations, not expecting the person to do all of the research.
Okay.
Taking on board some of that yourself and saying, okay, I'm responsible for you. I want to send you to this place, which we're not really sure how it's going to be. I'm actually going to take it off my own back to go and do the research instead of insisting that you have to do it.
Yeah.
I think that's quite an important point, is to take ownership of it as well.
And I think it's one of those things that, you know, we're talking generally about this as an issue. And obviously with some of the attendees today, they will have travel programs, perhaps where people are, you know, traveling to mainland Europe or domestically within the UK. So it's not necessarily as big a challenge. We have other customers that may be traveling to more far-flung destinations where, you know, there is a lot of additional complexity. But what's quite interesting there, I think, as you say, is that you just have to sort of stop and take the time to do the research about where you're going. And I think that the thing perhaps where we can help, or our account managers can help, is that if you ask us for information, we're here to assist.
Exactly. You know, the Foreign Office, the UK Foreign Office, are very, very good at providing travel information. I know that the US Homeland Security are as well.
Yeah.
They do provide information about up-to-date security threats, or you should be more aware if you're a woman walking around, you know, certain areas at night, that actually you should keep your wits about you and maybe get a taxi instead of walking the couple of blocks up the street to the hotel. So there is that information out there.
Yeah.
And like you just said, if you're not sure where to look, I'm sure we can point you in the same direction, or we can actually just help you find the information.
Okay, I think it's about being open and having conversations. As we said before, when you pick up on this topic, don't be afraid to ask. But it's, you know, there's work that needs to be done, especially with new destinations to far-flung places. Okay, that's interesting. And I think the other piece, we talked very briefly about technology. You know, the majority of bookings that we see as an agency, or the sort of principal booking channel, is now the online booking tool. And you know, today online booking tools don't provide the ability to provide information about additional needs. That tends to have to be done via sort of the traditional booking method of telephone or email. What's your thoughts on that? Is it, you know, should booking tools, you know, should the technology be able to do that? Or actually, do we need to be a little bit pragmatic and say, do you know what, to make sure things go right, actually, let's have a person doing this? What's your view?
I think that in an ideal world, we'd have both, and the person could choose which option they want to go with.
Yeah.
I think a lot of people, especially those with disabilities who are traveling, they don't necessarily trust if they put it in an online booking form that it's going to go anywhere or anyone's going to do anything with it.
Yeah.
So they always prefer to ring up and actually have a conversation with the person rather than go through a chat bot or whatever else, because then, you know, you're actually speaking to somebody, something more likely is going to happen.
Yeah.
But I think in an ideal world, you get both ends of that. But I think the really, really key thing, I think, is like I said before, is giving people information so that they can actually decide. You know, if you're a hotel, for example, does your hotel room, the listings for each room, mention how high the bed is off the ground?
Yeah.
Or does it mention that you have different types of accessible rooms, for example? You might have, we actually have a planning contingent if we have deaf customers staying with us, so therefore we have a fire evacuation plan in place.
Yeah.
Because they're not going to hear the fire alarm. And some of these sort of things are things that people just don't think about, because they know somebody that they might have a deaf guest staying with them, but they just don't make the brain connection to the fact that they won't hear a fire alarm. So these little things, and publishing that on your website and actually just giving information, that can really help bridge a gap, because then that person has the information themselves. They don't have to hunt around or just hope that it's in place. And you can maybe say, actually, we've booked this specific room for you. This is the requirements of the room. These are the details of the room. So you know what you're getting before you get there, and you don't have to have that little anxious in-between bit.
Yeah, I think it's quite interesting, because I know when we were having a conversation the other day and talking about accessibility, when it comes to disability, quite often the sign is of a wheelchair user. So that's, you know, today's conversation principally could have been around people that have that additional need. But I think it's the piece that's very interesting is that actually there's a whole diverse range of additional needs out there. It might be neurodivergency. It may very well be, you know, going back to sort of physical disability. So what advice would you give travel buyers and travel managers about navigating that and providing provision to the travellers and travel arrangers?
I think if you can tap into service users who are experiencing these things in real time and get their feedback, I think after someone's gone on a trip, just try and have a quick call with them. Check out how it went. Was your negative feedback? Because all feedback's really, really useful. If it goes badly, we can figure out where it's gone wrong and try and stop that so it doesn't happen next time. So I think those conversations and that feedback's really, really useful. I think as well for kind of suppliers side is also to not have an over-reliance on technology. You know, we've got all these self-check-in desks and stuff at airports now. But there's always going to be a section of especially people with disabilities who are going to be pushed away from that. If you're somebody, for example, is blind, it's not going to have screen reading software built into it.
No, of course. Yeah,
so
you're going to need someone to help.
It's not going to be the most accessible thing. So we still need to make sure that we have things like check-in desks that are actually staffed by human beings. Because again, it's that one-size-fits-all thing. It doesn't work for everybody. I know that my parents, who are getting into, they won't be saying this, but into their 70s, they would always rather go and speak to a person and have that face-to-face conversation because they trust it more. And I think this is where I think we can definitely do a lot of work is around building trust in technology that it's actually going to do the things you want when you need it to be done. And I think that's a really important step.
That's cool. Just a sort of final question, and I know we've got some more questions coming in from the audience, and what we'll do is we'll follow up afterwards with some answers on that, but we are very mindful of time here. What sort of, from a Graydor's point of view, what are we doing internally as a business? What are we going to be doing externally for our customers in this area? And how can our customers engage with us?
Yeah, so one of the things that I've sort of put in place since I came into the business is a sort of broadly EDI strategy going throughout the business. Every single member of staff is going to be going on EDI training. So there's large parts of that. And one of the significant parts that I think is really, really important is the part about just learning about disability and learning about the medical model and the social model. So for those of you who aren't aware, the medical model of disability is essentially there is something medically wrong with you and we want to try and fix it, whereas the social model is there's actually nothing wrong with you, but the world isn't built so that you can thrive in it. So it's kind of taking disability and looking at it from a completely different perspective that not a lot of people actually have. So I think that's really, really important. And one of the things that I think has the biggest impact, especially on our business consultants who are booking with clients, is actually, I understand more about how disability works for a lot of people and how it intersects in their life. So actually, I know the right questions to ask, or actually, I don't need to answer the questions because actually, I've gone to their profile, it's listed what their accessibility needs are. So that's all I need to go away and booking and find the right room that's going to fit their requirements.
Okay, so we're focusing on making sure that people within Graydor's aren't afraid to have those conversations. And that's good. And ultimately, I think it's, diversity and inclusion isn't something that sort of becomes part of your sort of your sales story. It's something that you just do.
Yeah, my whole ethos is that we shouldn't need to do separate things. Is that once I've kind of done my bulk EDI training, is that EDI just gets woven into everything. It should just be part of the training courses. So I'm doing a piece of work right now on recruitment. So actually looking at inclusive recruitment is just not a separate thing. It's just part of how we recruit so that we get the best people who will be the best people in their jobs and will work effectively because they don't have to worry about other stuff. They just know that they're going to be taken as who they are. And that's all included in our recruitment process. So just making sure that it runs through everything rather than being a sort of add-on. I think that's a really, really important thing at Graydor's.
Yeah, cool. And any final thoughts for today's session?
I think the most important thing, and I'll always just bang on about it, is to take the person as the person, not as the disability, because people might have more than one disability. You can have somebody who, for example, is a wheelchair user and is also deaf. And if you only focus on one of those disabilities, then you're going to completely miss the other part of them that has accessibility needs. Or you might have somebody who might, for example, be autistic and might also be gay. And how do those things co-interact when they travel? There could be so that they're going into somewhere that might not be the friendliest place. That might be their biggest concern. And being autistic, that might amplify the anxiety around it, changing their routine, all those sorts of things. So how can you actually support them? And sometimes just asking is, what do you need from me? And actually, if they say, oh, I'm not quite sure, saying, okay, that's fine. I'm actually going to go away and ring, for example, autism support group and see what more I could be doing, or I'm going to go away and do my own research in what the legal rights are in this particular area. And it's just not being afraid to take some of the ownership yourself.
Yeah.
Make sure you don't just put it on the person with the disability or with a protected characteristic, whatever it is there that they need. It's just not expecting them to do all of the heavy lifting. Be part of the team. I think that's the really, really important part.
Again, open conversations,
Exactly.
work together, and recognise that there's complexity out there, and there's no one size fits all.
Exactly, and the more you have conversations, the more you have open conversations, the easier they become.
Yeah.
So the first couple of times you might feel a little bit awkward being like that, but once you've done your 20th, 30th conversation, you're like, right, let's just crack on. What do you need, and how can I help you get there?
Yeah.
And those conversations become so normalised that they're not seen as a special thing.
It's ingrained into the way your program works. Okay, brilliant. Well, I think we're bang on time there. So thank you, Britt. It's been a really, really good session, and thank you also to the attendees that have joined today. There's plenty of great resources on our website. If you use the search function on there under diversity and inclusion, there's plenty of additional information. There's more coming. In addition, if you need support in this area, please speak to your account manager here at Grey Doors. That's the final Travel Talks session for 2024. Really excited. Next year, 2025, we'll be kicking off with travel trends in 2025. That session will be happening in January, and we'll be in contact soon about the date and time. So thank you for your time today, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.